Hello. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Devin Terrell. I am the Program Officer for Media at the Stanley Foundation. The Stanley Foundation is a nonpartisan, private operating foundation that focuses on multilateral solutions to global peace and security issues. In addition to focusing on climate change, we are focused on building resilience to mass violence and atrocities. And it has been very wonderful to collaborate with New America and GroundTruth Films to put together this event. I'm also very happy to be able to feature such powerful reporting from Laura Heaton and Nichole Sobecki. With that, I would like to hand it over to Beth Murphy from GroundTruth Films, who will introduce the film. We'll play the film, and then we will hopefully have a very interesting conversation after. Thanks.
Thank you, Devin. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Beth Murphy. I'm Director of Films at the GroundTruth Project. The GroundTruth Project is an international media organization, and we have a very special focus on training, mentoring, and supporting the next generation of journalists and filmmakers. Our two co-founders are here, Charlie Sennett and Kevin Grant. And we're so thrilled to have been able to support the incredible reporting that Nikki and Laura have done over the past 18 months. This really was an 18-month journey, reporting from Somalia and Kenya, and from two international climate change summits, COP21 and COP22. And the culmination of this incredible reporting is happening right now. The filmmaking and some of the photojournalism that was done was broadcast last night on ABC News Nightline. And Laura Heaton's written report, along with photography by Nikki, is in the Foreign Policy magazine this month. There are many, many copies in the back. I hope you'll grab one. And we've also created now this short film, a verite film, that is going to have its life both on the Foreign Policy website as part of their digital rollout for the project, as well as submitting it now to film festivals and have additional broadcast life down the road. There's also a podcast to listen to if you'd like to check that out on our website. With the films that we do, we really want to have an impact with them, and we try to build impact campaigns around them. And so it's very, very special to us to have this collaboration with New America and with the Stanley Foundation to really kick off the impact events for this film, A Climate for Conflict. This matters to us, to be able to have an impact and to be able to really use the film as a catalyst for conversation, for understanding, and ultimately for action. So thank you so much for being here today.
Weather pattern is going to create the fastest growing desert in the world.
You have seen dry valleys, big dry valleys. The livelihood of Somali people is entirely attached to the water and the land. You can imagine how fragile that is.
Climate change is linked to conflict in Somalia. Well, Somalia is not really the reason for these impacts of climate change, but we are paying the price for that.
With this weather pattern, Somalia or Somalis will not survive. A piece of desert called Somalia will exist on the map of the world, but Somalis cannot survive. We'll eat each other alive because this environment is not giving us anymore.
ma jirin allah un baan aqeelayay roob xagga roobnimada iyaan ka noolaanaynay roobkii abaar isku sudhanay noqotay guban bay wax ku da'een baanana yidhi gubankaan imanayna ableel baan ugu imanay ableelkiina waa naga iska baaba'ayno abaarta duuga la yidhaaha yaa wax duugtay haddaad magaceega doonayso duuga waxaa la yidhaaha ee dhammeeya dee abaarta inay dad iyo dunyaba haaqayso iyaanu malaynaynaa dad iyo dunyaba inay haaqayso dunyadii way dhammaysay dadkana inay daba kaxayso
shan iyo afartankaa sannadood abaartaa maanta dhacday ee xoola naga dhammaysay nolosha daciif bay galaysa markaa waxaa la yidhi ninkaan cuud lahayn ninkaan dunya lahayn doog waa u abaar ninka hadday dunyadu ka dhammaatay xoola ka dhammaadaan xeeradan adhigu dee intan u kala u buuxay labadaa geed waxay ahaayeen dee geeda ilaahay bixiye bay ahaayeen har kolka yar ahaayeen roobku da'o daad baa lacagta mari jiray markii hore berigii hore limaanaan garaac jiray waan daynay xoolaa harsan jiray oo dadka harsan jiray ciyaalka harsan jiray laakiin waxaa dhacday geedii inaan nagu kaliftay abaarta dheeraatee kuwii hore ka siyaadihii markay dhacday qoys tahay eed moogtay xoolina kaa dhammaadaan abaarina kugu dhacdo nolosha cidhiga ka gasho waxay ku kalifaysaa inaad ciyaalka u masaarifayso
Everybody wants to cut, burn, and think about what they can get today. But nobody is looking forward and saying what will happen in the next 20 years.
Charcoal production induces desertification and deforestation. The kids that are farmers will lose their jobs, and because they lose their jobs, they become radical. That is the conflict-environment nexus.
waxaan samayn jiray saxmad baan lahaa kalluunka iyo argoostada iyo libaaxan gulan jiray anagoo kalluunka iyo libaaxa ka shaqaysanaba waxaan lagu dhacday baraakiib baddaa ka timi oo dowlad kasta leh wixii shaqaalihii iyo jilifkii iyo qaabkii naga qaadatay dareenku waxaan caalamka hore baan u sheegnay badan baan u sheegnay markii wax laga qaban waayay waxaan u aragnay wax dee aan annaga gacanteeda mahay cid kale wax naga qaban karin annagu dee wasiixmadaan ku haysanay baddaasaan aadnay difaacii waardiyihiina aanu ku hayn weyno haddaan anayn ka waardiynayna maalintii la jiidanaya wixii dabeedna ataagaygu wuxuu noqday wuxuun dee aan iska ururino fuusta shidaala ama aaki ama lacag qorya gadno aanu meesha aadno un kolba dalkaaga u dhimo ama dadkaaga kaa dameeya u dhimo xaalad u ahayd
A very rich environment destroyed by people that come from other places. Kids would see that because of anger, they will become pirates.
When there are no jobs, they're attracted to any crime. It's easier for the extremists to persuade them and give them a plate of plain rice and mirror and have his ears and heart.
marka naxariistu ay yaraato ee meeshii la isku soo guuro taas marka dhibaatada keenaysa iyo isqabsiga waxaan rajaynayaa haddii ay taasi sii socoto ay taasi dhacdo waxay ila muuqataa aniga Soomaaliya ama Afrikaba haddii taasi dhacdo inaan nololba inaan jirin sababtoo ah dadku waxay ku tiirsan yihiin waa naxariista Ilaahay. حبدنا waxaa laga soo riday geedkaas ayuu ninku face kaga soo jiray geedkaas kaga soo riday halka isagoo fadhiya oo ceelka jooga ayuu dibadda marka la wada hadlo markii la soo xabad buu ku riday dibadda marka kan oo aan meesha soo gaarin ayuu wuxuu sii galay halkan markuu marayay ayuu laba mid
marka hadda soo guuray nafteeda dhibaato badan aan la kulmay kulli hor aan waa idin ku sheegay 27 maalin dhexda ku soo jiray dhexdan waan ugu qabsadeen oo ninka oo shabaabka ah 5 maalin meel ugu haysteen oo gaari oo marka hadda soo baxay waa diidanayeen in oo inta loo soo guuro سكورتي زائد وسي دران بس دي أباري أو كلا لأنك دي أسوء درجة نفتيس أو عملوا دي عملوا حر حتى عم كده بيس لكن نبغى نباي دي ستاسع وسي دراتي ها وكبيرة ها نك تيس بحث إنه باي بدي أم إلما باي كدي وكبيرة يعني زائد أو بيرام يعني واقولين والجهاد سيدي أو كأجنبي أو كلا الدلاء بلاي ninkii la jiro sidii hay'ada hadda aniga adigu qoto oo hadda la kulumnay qorta la goynay aadan oo kale nimankan la jira qorta la gooy iisan shaqdo aw absan qaba loo askarin kara ورماشي الدكسي أيجا أنا الدكسي كلام جري الدكسي يقول لي أو الدكسي يقول لي للتشكيلي بعقل قاضي بعير هاي حاب جورسن كربون نين أيجا هذا أيجا نفترض بجورسن كربون وصاصة يقول لك كلام
معنا وحوي وحرتين وحن فيليا inaan nololba inaan jirin hadii ay taasi ila muuqato aniga Soomaaliya ama Afrikaba
laakiin badii eba ay khasarada meesha ku jirta iyo dadkii dhibta ka socota dadkii kaare oo ka haralaabaan ku jira maanta taas waxa weey wasfuudahay waa ka soo fuudanaya maalin waxba la helaa maalin waxba la waayaa mar baan shidaal kugu go'aya nasiibك calaf markaasaa bannaanka uga leexdaan
maya meel oo dagaal ay ka socon hataa qori meel ay ka arkayeen aniga sidii aan qabo oo kala meel qori ay ka arkayeen ama seen dagaal ama laga tashkiilna oo kale in ay ku koraan horta maribi saas ay tahay anigu hadda takanina ma ka galan
My conviction and my belief is the security of this country, the existence of the people, of the Somali people, is entirely dependent on what happens in the natural resources. If we don't intervene as quickly as possible, we should expect more wars, we should expect more conflicts, and we should expect more terrorists who can recruit those desperate young boys. The question is, what can we do? Is it possible to intervene? And my answer is yes.
Because we are human and we are alive, we are thinking beings. And it's not in our nature, I think, to give up. Nobody likes to die sitting, yeah?
Well, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to get started, even though the lights are still out. I'm sure you can see me. There you go. I'm Sharon Burke. I'm a senior advisor here at New America, and I run our resource security program, which is researching, looking at the links between natural resources and national security. And specifically, as a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, what I'm interested in is how you build security. Because the last 15 years have taught us that fighting wars and being warfighters isn't enough. We also need to figure out how to build security. And so it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to talk about this with this audience. And at this point, I'd like to invite our panel to come on up, and I will introduce them. If you'll come on up, please. Laura and Nichole, why don't you sit over there? Sheikh, if I could ask you to sit right in the middle, because we're going to put science on trial here. Lee, I'd like you nice and close to me.
That's so you can thump me.
Oh, so I can pat you on the back every time you say something great, which will be frequent. This is a great panel, and let me introduce them to you. First, we have Nichole Sobecki and Laura Heaton. These are the two reporters who reported on this story, and they're going to tell you more about that. We're going to start off by talking to them about what they did. Laura is a writer and journalist based in Nairobi, Kenya, and she's been doing reporting there for some time now, focusing on human rights, on women's rights, on environmental degradation, on a whole range of issues. And her reporting has been in many, many different publications, some you would have heard of, like the New York Times. And the foreign policy that you can get here in the print edition is a wonderful example of her written work. But that's Laura, sorry. And Nichole is the first one there. It's a great partnership between these two, and they've been working together for some time. Nichole is a photojournalist who's had a lot of experience with, I think you were at Agence France Presse for some time, also based in Kenya. And I think what's really great about this project is the way these two people work together with images, with photographs, with stories, with words. And so we're going to get them to tell you more about their partnership. Next, we have Dr. Sheikh Mbao, who is the executive director of START International. He is the scientist on the panel. We have to have a scientist because this is complicated. And we're lucky because that's the mission of START, is to explain the science behind environmental degradation to a range of audiences with a focus on Africa and Asia Pacific. He himself also has worked at the World Agroforestry Center, where he was the senior scientist, so we're delighted to have him here today. Next to him, we have John Kurtz, who is with Mercy Corps. He's the Director of Research and Learning there at Mercy Corps. This is a great organization. It's a humanitarian organization that's directly involved in just about everything, I think, like humanitarian relief, development projects, peace building, conflict settling, all of this, the full range. One of the things I really particularly like about Mercy Corps, and we're very lucky to have John here because it's really his bailiwick, is they're also doing a lot of work to think about these challenges and to use data and analytics to understand the roots of conflict, the roots of insecurity, the roots of misery, and how do you best make an investment in a different kind of world. So we're delighted to have you here. Next to him is Vice Admiral Lee Gunn. So Vice Admiral Gunn, I've known for a little while and can say, first of all, what you should know is this is a highly decorated military veteran who wore 3 stars on his shoulder before he retired from 35 years of service in the Navy. And I think his last position was Inspector General. He's been a very high-level officer, but he's also been a wartime commander and has had, tens of thousands of people under his command. And one of those commands, he's what we would call in the Navy a SWO, so a surface warfare officer. He's a ship driver. Or more to the point, towards the end of his career, got other people to drive the ships and told them where to go. At one point in his career, in 1995, he was the deputy task force commander in Somalia. So he has a different experience of this, but I also want to be clear that he's on the military advisory board of CNA. He's a vice chairman for that, which this man could have done anything with his post-military career, and he's given a lot of his time and attention to climate change and water resources and energy and how they relate to security. So we're delighted to have all of you here. Let me start the conversation with Nichole and with Laura, Nichole and Laura, to talk about how did you start this reporting? And I know that the GroundTruth Project has been supporting you for about 18 months, but your interest in this particular story started sooner. So how did you come to it?
So I've been living in Kenya for 7 years, and I had learned about a project that sounded really fascinating to me, that UNDP, UN Development Program based in Kenya, was doing a whole survey in Somalia looking at how local communities were adapting to climate change. They were putting together a big policy report that was going to help. It was actually kind of a prerequisite for Somalia to be eligible for a lot of environmental funding that exists in the world for developing countries and countries in post-conflict. In talking to some people who are working on that survey, I thought how fascinating to really go to the root causes of this, to talk to elders, to get their insights on what it takes to combat climate change, environmental degradation. How do they understand these issues in their own community, and what are they doing personally over generations, developing these traditions to cope with extreme climate, because Somalia has always had extreme climate, and people have really quite well-developed resiliency techniques. So in talking to them a bit about this project that they were doing, this massive survey in 2012, I think, and 13, it came up that there was actually this old collection of photographs, and we've come to call it like an archive, but what it really turned out to be was tens of thousands of photographs that were stashed in a woman's attic in a house in the British countryside. And the backstory was that she was a researcher in Somalia in the 80s, and she had worked on the only comprehensive land survey ever undertaken in Somalia. And she had been working with a leading climate scientist, we called him, at the time, we didn't really talk about climate scientists, but he was a Cambridge-educated ecologist named Dr. Murray Watson, and he led this team that did this land survey over many years. If you pick up a copy of Foreign Policy in the back of the room, you'll see a bit more about his story. But basically what we did is I went to the UK, just kind of on a whim, like we'll see how this pans out. And this woman, her name is Jenny, she was very welcoming. She said, this is a huge array of material that Dr. Watson saved from 1991. He saw what was happening as the country devolved into civil war, and he thought, if I don't take this out, it's going to probably be lost forever. And as we know very sadly now, after a quarter century of conflict, that's exactly what would have happened. We would never have had all of this material. So working with Dr. Watson's family, I started thinking about how to do a project that might go back and see whether there was much change, because we had all of these photographs. The tragic twist in all of this, but also the real irony, is that in 2008, Dr. Watson himself was kidnapped by al-Shabaab. He was in southern Somalia doing a land survey of a river system for the UN. He was ambushed, and he and his Kenyan colleague, an engineer he was traveling with, were kidnapped. They've never been heard from since. So there was a real sense from the family's perspective, too, of wanting to not just do an expose on him, but how could this work that he had worked in, really risked his life to save, could be used to look at issues in Somalia today, a place that he loved so dearly. So that's when Nikki and I teamed up, because I felt like I'm a writer, and I thought immediately this has to be a project that we team up and do the visuals from the beginning. And so we basically we went to the UK together, and we went and saw the images and felt like we don't know what we'll find. Like, if we can try to retrace Dr. Watson's steps to some extent, following the hand-drawn maps he had also left behind, it really was like a bit of a treasure hunt to see what we would find. And we weren't sure that it would be a dramatic visual contrast, but we set off, and that was the journey. And along the way, we met all of these people. So I'm going to pick up there.
I think you've kind of taken just a good stab at it. We can. Yeah.
Well, I think one thing I'd like to ask you in particular, Nikki, is, well, first of all, was it what you were expecting? You saw all these archival photographs, but also you were in a dangerous place, and in a not only that, but a tragic place.
Yeah.
That's in the middle of a historic drought. Right now, I believe that something like half the country is considered to be at risk, which is 6 million people. The population of Somalia now is about 12 million people. So 6 million people at risk for food insecurity, and a portion of that for starvation. So you as a photographer, and you can see Nikki's images that we've posted some of them. There's postcards that you can take with you. And of course, she filmed this as well. You as a filmmaker, can you talk to us a little bit about what it feels like and how your process for deciding what images and how you work together on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you brought up the challenges with security and also the challenges of really knowing what story we were going to find on the ground. And those things go together. We don't have all the information we wish we had on what's happening in Somalia, because scientists simply can't be on the ground gathering it in the way that they can in other parts of the world. At the same time, that same challenge existed for us. We put a tremendous amount of time and research into planning every trip that we made. And our goal was to go and to sort of retrace some of the steps of these scientists that were there in the late 70s and early 80s and see how this landscape had been transformed. And we didn't know what we would find. In the end, it was unfortunately quite dramatic. I think you can see in one of the pages in the Foreign Policy magazine in the back a series of diptychs of photos from the archive and photos that that I took on this journey retracing these steps. And it's stunning to see how the land has been degraded, how water resources and grazing lands are becoming ever more scarce. And on this journey, we met dozens and dozens of Somalis whose lives are being transformed today. And I think that was a key takeaway for us, that this is not a problem that's facing future generations. An entire country, and obviously this is happening in many other parts of the world as well, is having their lives transformed today. So this is a problem for now. And I think that's something we really hope to try highlight in the images and the film and in Laura's writing as well.
So you had to, I mean, I assume that you had to travel, well, I know you did because I've listened to your podcast, but you had to travel with security everywhere you went, right? Did that make it hard for you to take pictures? Did it make it hard for you to connect with people and to tell their stories?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, in Hargeisa, we didn't have to have security, but that's really one of the only places that was true. Legally, you have to have special police units if you're in Puntland or Somaliland, traveling with you. In Mogadishu, we had to have private security.
And in the
so
refugee camp as well, right?
In the refugee camp as well, you have to have Kenyan police. So it's a huge challenge, not only because having security forces looming around you is a far less than ideal way of sort of connecting and building trust and allowing, I think that in any situation as a journalist, you go in and you build a relationship with the people that you work with, and it's built on trust, it's built on respect, and it was especially challenging to have military or police with you while you're trying to do that. We also had very little time in the places we were. And so I think one of the things that we tried to do was to not go only once to meet people, to go to meet them, and then to return again if we could, and to try to sort of build that trust slowly and create as much intimacy and authenticity to the stories that they shared with us as we were able to do.
You also spoke to some very impressive Somali experts. I was reading your work and watching the film, was very impressed at how many people, highly qualified scientists, are really dedicated to this and have gone back to Somalia in some cases. Can you tell us a little bit about their stories too, because a number of them were in that film?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a small but quite mighty number of people who are so devoted to this topic. And we spent a lot of time, Dr. Abdi Rizak, whose voice was in the film, and he's kind of the centerpiece of the foreign policy piece. He is a remarkable guy. He was in government for a long time. He was part of the National Range Agency, which was this sort of environmental ministry, essentially, that was functioning it was set up in the late 70s in response to a massive drought that happened in the mid-70s in Somalia. And one of the quite striking points that Dr. Abdi Rizak and the former head of the National Range Agency have made to us is, they're obviously quite hesitant in the aftermath to laud President Siad Barre for anything, but certainly on the environment, he was strong on the environment, and he managed to get a lot of resources for the National Range Agency. Apart from the military, it was the best funded government agency in the country, which is quite striking. And when you think about the way Somalia deals with environmental issues today, that says a lot. I would say the other really important person that we met along the way was Dr. Buri Hamza, whose voice was also in the film. And then as you learn at the end of the film, it was actually about a month after we had interviewed him. And we'd come away from the interview saying, all right, this guy's like a very polished politician. He's Canadian Somali. He's moved back to Somalia to work on environmental issues. And he's the climate conflict nexus guy in the film. And a month after we interviewed him, he was killed in this terrorist attack in downtown Mogadishu. And it was particularly, we felt personally quite devastated to learn this news. It also just felt like his words were even more poignant than we had imagined, because one of the things that he talked to us about a lot was he was quite encouraged by the fact that they had put their national adaptation program together. They were going to be eligible now for several rounds of environmental funding. But he also admitted that it's really hard to get people to come to donors to come to Somalia and see the projects. And he says, donors say to me, you guys need to get your security under control, and then we'll come. And his point was, if we're not addressing these environmental issues, if we're not looking at climate change and environmental destruction, like now, the security is going to become harder and harder for us to cope with. And he's one of the people in the film who talked a lot about deforestation and desertification is what is a leading cause for radicalization. People get pushed to extremes, and then they have no choice but to turn to the extremists who can offer them a plate of rice, as Fatima says. So it felt like when we heard of his death, it just really kind of highlighted to us just how real his concerns are, and also what a dilemma people like him and Dr. Abdi Rizak face trying to do this work.
John Kurtz of Mercy Corps, could you tell us a little bit more about, pull back a little bit and tell us what the situation in Somalia is right now, and in your work to understand resilience, peace building, what the challenges are, and just how bad the situation is right now, so our audience gets a sense of that.
Sure. And to start, I really want to say that I was struck and inspired by the film. I feel like I know a fair bit about this topic and about Somalia, but it certainly gave me a new perspective on it and really brought out the human agency and choices and how they're really constrained. So that's, I think, great in terms of raising awareness. Obviously, the key is then translating that awareness into effective action. And in Somalia right now, I think, Sharon, you described it pretty well in terms of the situation of drought and pending famine. We know that there, as well as other places, a lot of that is driven by conflict as sort of the primary driver of food insecurity and drought. I guess the point I'd like to make is there's sort of two storylines that I see within the film that I think are helpful to unpack a little bit. And they really are around the two types of conflict that were highlighted. The first is really this intercommunal conflict. And I think there was a story of Ali's cousin who was shot, over this competition at the well. And this is something that we see is quite common, both in Somalia as well as Somalia region of Ethiopia, in the Sahel. It may be pastoral conflict, it may be farmer pastoral conflict, largely driven, I think, as rightly pointed out in the film, by resource constraints, scarcity that are made worse by climate change. The other type of violence, though, that is highlighted importantly was around violent extremism, in particular for Somalia, Shabab. And here it's interesting because I think the film also points to livelihood insecurity driven by climate change as an underlying cause of support for or engagement in Shabab. And certainly, the stories that we're told are true, and economic conditions and financial incentives do play a role in promoting extremist groups and armed opposition groups. But our research in Somalia, as well as in places like Afghanistan and Nigeria, are really pointing to governance-related grievances as drivers of support for armed opposition groups. So it's sort of distinguishing that political violence and what is the nature of why people would support groups like Shabab. And I think for us, it's looking more at issues around injustice, government discrimination, corruption, abuses by security forces that on top of joblessness, are really sort of, creating a tipping point. And I'll let the scientists on the panel sort of explain more of where that comes from. But for us, the implication is, in addition to trying to grow our way out of these challenges of sort of the climate conflict nexus, whether that's environmental side or growth in terms of jobs, there is a real underlying kind of governance issues in Somalia's case in point, but I think Nigeria, Yemen, the list goes on, are also really important to understand in that light.
Let me ask Vice Admiral Gunn a quick question, and then Dr. Mbao, you're on deck. I want you to talk about the science behind this. The question I want to ask you is, what John was just saying seems to me is very consistent with what the Pentagon and with what the organization you're affiliated with right now, CNA, how it has described climate change as an instability accelerant. So not so much a cause of war. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, or even just answer the question, do you think climate change is a legitimate national security concern?
Yes, I do, absolutely. The entire military advisory board at CNA, now 35 retired 3- and 4-star flag officers from all services, of all political stripes, for the last 12, 13 years have been looking at the national security implications of climate, water, food, and energy. So we brought in 2006 and 2007, I think for the first time, to the public consciousness the notion that there is a very definite connection between the conditions that we see changing around the world, its effect on the people who live in the places that are most severely impacted, and the resulting insecurity that they suffer, and the consequence management that the military has always been pretty good at. And as a matter of fact, the first 25 years of my Navy career, I would characterize my service and that of my comrades as consequence management. But with the fall of the Soviet Union and in the dozen or so years that follow, the Defense Department, in a leading position, but all of the senior officers in the military from all services became aware that we needed to do more, that we needed to help the government, the US government, and other governments anticipate the problems that would result from the changing climate, and that we needed to be out in front in the Defense Department itself, in a job that Sharon did in operational energy, in understanding and being good stewards of the energy that is expended in the military and executing the missions that the American people task us with. This accelerant of instability that Sharon was talking about is exactly what we're seeing around the world as the conditions become more severe, as the impact on populations, and you talked about governance, John, the weak and failing states, which are already experiencing difficulty providing services to their people, providing the security that I admire very much, the situation you two went into. Those conditions are aggravated by the impact that the changes have on individual people, the moving margins between agriculture of the farming kind and agriculture of the herding kind, for example. As those margins move, and we see them moving in various places around the world, people who used to succeed in one place have to go to somewhere else. And in the movie, one of the people who was testifying to her situation said when she arrived, anticipating that things would be better, they in fact weren't. So we see this around the world, and we've taken a couple of opportunities as a military advisory board to put out reports that testify to this connection.
So it's not uncommon for uniformed military to be looking at security as more than just war fighting.
Not at all. As a matter of fact, there are a couple of dozen of us, again, 3- and 4-star retired officers who are part of the U.S. Global Leadership Conference. And our sole mission there is to reinforce the importance to the Congress and the administration of the budget that supports development and diplomacy. Because we have seen the impact that the relatively small investment Americans make in their diplomatic services and in the development process, the great leverage that that investment has in avoiding problems that eventually would have to be dealt with by the military if they weren't dealt with on a more humanitarian plane.
So Sheikh, I want to expand that back out because Somalia has a long, amazing history. I think I was reading that the ancient Egyptians used to call it the land of the gods because it was so prosperous in ancient times. And so this is a country that's been a trading nation. It's pastoralists, but it's also been a very active trader in the world for a long time, for thousands of years. Tough colonial history, where the country was divided up among the Italians, the British, and the French. Mm-hmm. And that was a legacy that continues to be problematic. In the Cold War, again, a tug of war between the United States and the Soviet Union, and a dictator that played both sides and did some good things, but also some not so good things. And then a fall into civil war in 1991, and it's been war ever since. I think there are some hopes now. Some parts of the country are a little more stable than other parts. There are some hopes that maybe Somalia can turn the corner. And of course, now, as I said, there's 1 million people at least in refugee camps, 1 million people internally displaced. There's a large Somali population in this country, which has been to our great benefit. But this is not new for Somalia, having an arid climate and being close to the edge. Mm-hmm. Does climate change put them over the edge? Can you talk to us about the science and what it means for this region and more broadly? But the science is hard to understand, and that's what your job is to make it easy. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the science.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you for my co-panelists and looking forward to the interaction with the audience here. The situation in Somalia is very common in Africa. The conditions in Somalia are very similar to many other conditions in the rest of Africa, if you take the Sahel Strip. It's a condition of 2 or 3 months rainfall at best every year. Over 12 months, you only have 2 or 3 months of rainfall. At best, you will have a total rainfall of 250 millimeters every year. And the productivity for livestock and for human being depends to those 350 millimeters of 2 months every year. So you can just think in your imagination there will never be enough productivity if no intervention or technology or innovation is applied to save water for productivity. What is happening in Somalia is related to several connected factors, and I will try to pitch out just 2 of them. The first one is we take it as climate change. It's a whole change in the humidity transfer from the ocean. Humidity comes from 2 sources, either from the ocean, from evaporation, or from trees, evapotranspiration. From ocean, the temperature of ocean has been changing. You all know about El Nino, La Nina. You all about the planet warming, which is affecting sea surface temperature. This has an implication directly on the wind and its characteristic and the direction of wind. If wind has less moisture, it's very likely that we'll have less rainfall on the continent. If wind change directions, it's likely that a lot of moisture will be diverted to other places. At the same time, we have drought in Somalia. You have been hearing about flooding in Bangladesh and other continents. Those things are very linked. It's all about the disturbances in the way the climate patterns are established in that region. So the sea surface temperature and the climate change is certainly one big thing to be pitched out. The second thing, which is not something you always see in the literature, is related to the deforestation in other places. Deforestation in Tanzania, deforestation in Kenya, deforestation in the Congo Basin, believe me, are affecting the distribution of water, which is influencing the productivity in Somalia. By doing that, when the wind comes in the continent, if there is no evaporation, that the humidity in the air will dry out very quickly. They need to build up the humidity as they cross the continent to be able to provide water in different places. The same thing is happening in West Africa. It's a monsoon. We call it a monsoon process. It's coming from low pressure, high pressure to low pressure, and the high pressure are being warmed now, and the low pressure is so far away, and land has been so much, deforested that the wind cannot carry a lot of humidity. So what we have is a shortage of water, and sometimes that shortage of water can be up to 30% in the average evaluation we get. So the little we get is cut up by more than 30% in many instances. So that little water which is coming found also another kind of important climate pattern, which is the increase of temperature. You have little water and it evaporates the next day. There's little which goes in the soil that create the condition for the plant to grow. And these are the direct consequences. A lot of indirect consequences is something the movie has started with, is the degradation of land. Because that water comes very small. The starting of the rainy season is late, and the end of the rainy season too soon. So the rainy season is getting shorter. But at the same time, in the middle of the rainy season, you can have many events. Extreme rains. 80% of the overall season rain can rain in 2 days. This creates degradation of land, flooding, whatever. Another issue is sometimes in the middle of the rainy season when you expect plant to get water, the water does not come. We call it dry spells. And that small water we need for the plant to mature, that water is not there, and it creates big famines. So there is so many small factors that can modulate the impact of climate change on the ground that we have to pay attention to those factors. So the indirect effects is land degradation, competition for the small resources, deforestation. Charcoal is a response to adaptation, but at the same time, it accelerates climate change. Soil fertility loss. So many other, secondary factors that can, amplify the resource scarcity and the threat onto resources. So climate, and trying to connect it with conflict, which is not my area so much. I used to say that in 2009, I told in a conference with Ouagadougou, that the crisis in the 21st century will not be ideological. It will be natural resource driven. And in many instances, we are saying that. But the conflicts are not exclusively related to climate, because similar countries with similar climate conditions with a better system would survive those kind of conflicts. But climate change is certainly a modulator and an amplificator of those conflicts.
So in a way, it's a hopeful message, which is
Yes.
not every drought is going to cause a war.
Yes, exactly.
But John, maybe you can comment on that, because you've done a lot of work on that about building societal resilience to this. So how do you do that? How do you untangle that knot? If not every drought causes a war, but it does in Somalia.
I'd say just, I mean, to
Or
start,
vice versa, right.
Let's think about targeting, right? So there's certain conditions under which that link is more likely to happen. You know, global warming is going to lead to armed conflict, and Somalia typifies kind of all those conditions that you mentioned. So, you know, I guess to start, when we think about investments, you know, targeting conflict-affected fragile states to start, including with sort of adaptation funding. The second, from our side on a programmatic level, is really thinking about investing in conflict prevention and management as part of natural resource management and climate change adaptation programs. So we have a great example of this in the Somali region of Ethiopia in the lead up to the 2011 drought there. And then in this case,
it was devastating, right?
Right, on a similar magnitude of what's happening now. And there, I mean, the story essentially unfolded as this was a natural resource management program, but it was working a lot around building peace agreements that governed how conflicting groups shared resources, and then doing a lot of capacity building around sort of traditional and official local government officials on how to enforce those agreements. So the 2011 drought rolls around, not a huge surprise, but in those areas where these peace accords had taken root, people had a lot more mobility to be able to access pasture, water further afield. So it was sort of the opposite of Ali's cousin's story, where they could negotiate access to land and water in neighboring areas. So the upshot is, you know, there was both less conflict, better security in those areas, but also a dividend around those households able to really cope with that severe drought without losing as many livestock or you know, losing as many assets, so we're able to recover more quickly. So for us, we're trying to look for those kind of win-win solutions that both build conflict prevention as well as sort of the systems that people rely on to support themselves when there is a
And you think that's
shock.
knowable? You can find those win-win solutions?
I mean, we have a few examples. I think it's also important to recognize that there are things that clearly don't work, that do receive a lot of investment at the moment. So obviously, you know, places that are more secure are going to be more drought resilient generally. That's pretty obvious. But we've also seen ways of addressing insecurity that work against resilience. So for example, in northern Uganda, in the Karamoja region there, insecurity has been addressed largely by disarmament and settlement of largely pastoral groups. So the drought that hit there last year, not as severe, but we saw a lot more vulnerability to the drought because people were clustered in areas. They didn't have the mobility and freedom of movement that they did to be able to rely on traditional kind of mechanisms. So it's sort of, how do you address security in ways that also have resilience dividends is what we've been looking for.
I mean, Sheikh, do you think we know enough about climate change? There's a lot of uncertainties involved to bring it into the kind of planning that John's talking about?
Yeah, if I just take the picture of climate change or the rhetoric behind climate change and put it aside and just look at facts. Let's go back to West Africa, in East Africa, and look at the facts. Okay. You mentioned the 1917 drought. You mentioned the 2011 drought. You mentioned the current drought. I think just based on this fact, you can call it whatever you want, climate change or not. These are real facts where water scarcity and change in weather pattern are creating serious problem on the ground. I don't mind you call it climate change or something else. That's really the fact. And if you take the temperature, it's the same. I personally take measurement, station measurement, not satellite-based, station measurement over 30 years. We did it in Burkina Faso, we did it in Senegal. The temperature is increasing by 1.5 to 2 degrees. And this is not minimal when the rate of evaporation and the degree days of the plant require a certain temperature to grow and to mature. That's a real concern. Same with rainfall. We take daily rainfall of 30 days, daily, every day. And what we notice is a higher frequency of longer dry spells, higher frequency of longer dry spells. The dry spells of 2 weeks, their frequency are higher during the rainy season. Imagine that you have a plant which grows over 2 months. After 1 month, you have 3 weeks of rainfall shortage. There's no way you can collect anything but small biomass. There is no millet, there is no maize. And this relates to the possibility of pests and diseases to be readily available to destroy the remaining crops. We're talking about the armyworms now in Africa. We're talking about the striga plants. We're talking about the locust invasions. Those things comes as a side factor, as a side event related to those changes in the weather that affect crops and productivity. So I don't take the rhetoric of climate change, which I believe in many respects, because I'm an IPCC member. I was part of the guys who was doing this report. And I believe on what they said because it's based on robust science and modeling and stuff. But just to bring it to a common understanding, just take the real facts and observe what those facts are. And you will understand that climate plays a big role in resource productivity.
I want to continue on this theme of uncertainty and take it to Lee. But first, Nikki, Laura, I feel like to some degree your reporting is a portrait in uncertainty and how people actually, the human cost of volatility. Is that fair to say that what you were talking about was that people don't know?
Absolutely. They don't know. And I think there's an interesting point from the story of Ali, the man whose cousin was killed over this access to pasture land. And one of the things that we found was quite poignant is, you hear a lot about intercommunal violence in Somalia, like clan-based violence. And we were in this little outside of this little village, it was very remote, talking to this family. It was like maybe 5 different houses on this homestead, all sort of centered around the well. And one of the things that came out as we talked to them about what had happened in the 2 weeks since the killing was, several of the cousins from one of the families had gone off looking for the shooter who had fled immediately after the attack. And they were saying to us, we need to find this guy and he will be killed. Like, that's the way this works, is like there's sort of the way that justice kind of works in that community, far from the reach of the Somali government, is one person dies, someone else has to die in exchange from the family. And so they said, we have to find that guy. If we don't find him, then someone else from his family will likely pay that price. And it was really striking to us, like having read a lot of reports about intercommunal violence in Somalia and thinking, here we are standing at the cusp of what could unfold over the next 20 years as intercommunal violence. And like we could come back to this place 20 years later and the community could tell us, oh, there was these 2 families have been feuding for many years. It's engulfed our whole area. The woman whose portrait is in the back, she's Ali's daughter. So like, who knows how that will affect her life over the next 20 years. And here we were standing just at the cusp of it, where we're saying, this is about a piece of pasture land, but it can take on all of these other contours as time progresses.
And just to add on to what Laura said, Somalia has been hot and dry for a long time. This is not new, but droughts are becoming more frequent, they're becoming more severe, and that's breaking down people's natural resistance. So they know how to cope when a drought happens every 10 years. They don't know how to cope, and it's impossible when you're, have this narrow buffer already to do that every single year. And it's breaking down people's natural resistance and natural methods of survival. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that people are just being pushed beyond the brink.
I'm going to ask all of you one last question, but first I have something for Lee, and then we'll bring in the audience and let them ask questions too. The question I'm going to ask you, I'm putting you on warning so you can think about it for a minute, is so this is a pretty bleak picture, and this is a situation where there's a lot of strands tangled up. What can we do? But Lee, before we do that, I wanted to ask you, and feel free anybody else to comment on this too, because I think you all might have thoughts on this, do you think it's a good thing, an advantageous thing, to connect the military, defense, national security community with the humanitarian, with the scientists, with the media on an issue like this? Is that a good thing, or is it problematic? The military has its own mission. What do you think could be gained from connecting these communities?
Not only do I think it's a good thing, I think it's essential. For a couple of reasons. One is that the American military is probably organizationally the most capable large effort in the world. We are extraordinarily well organized, we're well funded, we're well equipped, and we're well trained. It's evident over the last dozen years or so that that training can be adapted to humanitarian assistance and disaster response, for example, which became an official DoD, Defense Department mission just recently in 2008. And the point was that until then, the assumption underlying our mission set was that if we were capable of dealing with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, we'd be easily able to handle humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. I can talk at length about how that works and how it was true at the time. But as humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and response become a more valuable commodity, as the frequency, as Nichole points out, of the things that people have learned to experience over the years on an occasional basis now are coming at them repeatedly, and therefore the U.S. military, on behalf of the American people, will be involved in a humanitarian response. It's really important that we organize, train, and equip for that. At the same time, we have to become more and more aware of our surroundings, at least a different characterization of our surroundings. It used to be we were concerned about the intelligence aspect, the threat from a fairly unified foreign adversary. It's not that way anymore. The world is fragmented. The climate change, in my view, is statistical. It's very difficult to tie an individual event to the change in climate, but collectively, statistically, as you pointed out, the frequency of these things is increasing. Yesterday, Bangladesh was hit with another one of those cyclones, typhoon, hurricane, if you're in our part of the world. And it's devastated every time. And India anticipates that Bangladesh will increasingly be subjected to this kind of onslaught, and therefore has built a fence between India and Bangladesh to keep the Bangladeshis from entering India. I mean, so this is an example of the state-on-state consequences, which we could also extend to the shrinkage of Lake Chad and Lake Victoria in Africa, and the watershed that results from that. Anyway.
Now I'm going to make a comment that I do not mean to be political, because I don't consider this to be a partisan issue, and then we'll get into what you think the solutions might be, which is that if we've learned nothing over the last 15 years, it's that our means of war, which we're very good at, are not enough. And certainly that's clear in Somalia. We cannot kill our way out of the problem with al-Shabaab. We cannot use strictly military means. If you want to fix everything that's wrong and rebuild this country, that doesn't mean that I know the answers, but I do know that it's not enough that we have a good military machine. We have to be good at diplomacy, at development, at other kinds of investments. And I very much am concerned about this administration's lack of faith and understanding, at least if you look at their budget numbers, of how important that is. And again, if we learned nothing as a military over the last 15 years, is that it's not enough to fight a war, that you have to be able to build security, and that's not strictly at the end of a gun. And most people I know in uniform would agree with that.
Absolutely.
So, so what do we do? Shay, you're nodding and smiling, so what do we do?
I was just thinking that this debate could be for a week, and then we keep going. First of all, very good observation. I think my perspective on security is that there is one inclusive security. There's one security where you put the military security inside. You have water security, energy security, food security. All of them are extremely important dimensions of security. In terms of solution, I will give you maybe two layers. The first layer is the regional and national policy trend, which is happening in Africa in general. And this has been pushed by the UN conventions under the Bonn land neutrality, land degradation neutrality, and also the African Union under the Vision African Union 2063. And the program itself is trying to do land rehabilitation for 100 million hectares of degraded land across Africa. And Ethiopia has gone through their plans, and Kenya is going through their plans, and we hope that a lot of investment will be put in the land, in having the right tree in the right place. And if you see in the movie, most of those trees are, stony trees of acacia or prosopis, trying to see how much we can domesticate more of those trees to be grown in the right place. Importing trees from different ecologies to the foreign ecologies does not work. I call it exotic trees, and it never works, based on the experience we saw in Africa. African Union is developing also a big program which is called the Great Green Wall. I'm not sure if everyone have heard about it. It's an ambitious program which is trying to build a kind of integrated livelihood program with trees as a main engine of land rehabilitation from Dakar to Djibouti. And it's very ambitious, but the big problem the African Development Bank had to fund it is to find secure area where they can invest money. The problem is when you invest money and there is no security, the monitoring and the survey, it becomes a big difficult. So it's a bit conundrum for the Great Green Wall as well. So at regional level, there are so many initiatives. Now comes to local level. I worked for 5 years as a head of climate change department at World Agroforestry Center. We was trying to work a lot on domesticated plant to create not only trees, but trees that matters for people. Trees that can bring fruits, trees that can bring fiber and firewood. You mentioned it. If the little trees which are remaining on the land is destroyed for charcoal, and by the way, the charcoal is not only for local market, it can be for the Arabic Peninsula market. And that creates a dimension of teleconnections in the security issues. We did not mention it here. But that requires that aggressive programs of tree plantations for local livelihood needs is addressed. The right trees for the livelihood, for the right livelihood, the right trees for the right place. And we can do it in several ways. We can do it around farms to improve soil fertility. We can do it to reduce erosion. We can also do it to reduce invasive species. Most of the sand which has been mobilized by erosion is going to have a side effect on the existing freshwater. It's going to create a big clogging on the existing freshwater, which was used for fisheries and other things. So to me, the solution is to create a bottom-up approach where context-based knowledge is used to plant more trees and to rehabilitate ecosystem to improve livelihood and lives in those harsh conditions.
John, a context-based approach sounds very Mercy Corps to me. But the two of you too, let's let John follow on that. But I'd be interested if in the people you spoke to, if they had ideas about what might work for them. What about Mercy Corps? How is Mercy Corps solving this?
So my response up until recently would have been, let's work on figuring out the plumbing of this problem set. So what are the technical solutions, whether they be on the ecosystem side or the peace building side or institutional strengthening side? What are those? How can we generate evidence to put in front of national governments, international actors to invest in the right things? And it pains me to say this as a researcher, but I'm not sure evidence is the gap at the moment, or is the leverage point that we really need to work on. At this point, building on your point, Sharon, I think it's really protecting the spigots of water coming in. And from what we see, including the draft budget from the administration from last week, major development and humanitarian accounts are going to be cut by up to 50%. So again, those would sort of eliminate our ability to implement a range of solutions that we already have and try others. So I guess as a starting point of being able to defend and if not increase certain pots that would go towards addressing some of the root causes of the conflict climate nexus.
Okay, and while we're hearing what people you talked to said, get ready if you have a question. The microphone's going to be around. Please wait for the mic and identify yourself. Say who you are. If you'd like to say who your affiliation is, that'd be great. We do have a big audience online, so make sure you wait for the mic. So the people that you talked to, did they have ideas about what would work?
Sure, yeah. So as you'll see in the foreign policy piece, the scene that I decided to end on and talk to Nikki quite a lot about was, throughout the time that we were doing this reporting, we really did want to sort of bring it back to some hopeful, bright spot in all of this. And for both of us, actually, it's phenomenal to me too, because we were just spending time at the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi, because Dr. Abdi Razak has this initiative in mind, and it's really early stages. I don't want to overstate it and say it's going to be this sort of panacea approach, but really his hope is to work with the seed bank at the World Agroforestry Center in Nairobi and eventually reintroduce some of these indigenous plants that have either gotten extinct in Somalia or there's so little biodiversity left that they've kind of become rather mutated. So he lives in a region called Puntland that is relatively safe. And so what you see is Somalis looking for pockets of stability where they can try out projects with the ambition that if that works in this small area, they can expand out. And so going to the seed bank with him and meeting with the director of the seed bank, we felt encouraged. I mean, it's early stages. Who knows who's going to fund it? I mean, it's really, we'll see what happens, but it felt like a moment of hope in that, and he's very committed to this initiative, so we'll see.
And I think taking a slightly more macro approach, I think one of the things that will lead to real meaningful investment in these types of projects is the recognition of the links between the environment and security. And we end our film, we start this story in the foreign policy piece in the late 70s, early 80s, when the National Range Agency was, other than the military, the highest funded government agency. And by the time we were interviewing Burry Hamza, who is the state minister for the environment, it was probably the least funded government organization. And one of Burry Hamza's jobs, and what he lost his life doing, was trying to advocate for this and make people understand that meaningful investment in security means protecting the environment, and it means building a sustainable future for the people living in these countries. And I think recognizing that link and making those investments in real ways is a big part of what we need to do to build security.
Thank you. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. And I think just a comment on that, John and Lee and I were talking before too, that it used to be that you could sequence these things. You could have your war and then deal with the destruction later and rebuild. But that timeline has really collapsed now. And you can't really, if you want to stabilize a situation and end a war, you have to be investing in the root causes as well. All right, Andrew, would you like to choose a victim? Well, Lee, you know you're going to get that question if I sound a gun. And I'll just say yes, in fact, a U.S. special operator was killed last month, which was evidence that this is not just a policy shift. This is a shift on the ground. Do you have any thoughts on that? Especially, this is like, I'm sure, brings back memories because, of course, Lee was there in 1995 helping to coordinate the retreat of American forces. I know it's a different time, but...
Yeah. I have, I think, matured in my opinion of this, and my guess is that 20 years ago I would have applauded without reservation the increasing pressure that will be put on al-Shabaab by U.S. Special Forces. I remain convinced that it will be effective. My concern is that it will only be effective in the short run, and that our failure as a nation to deal with the diplomacy and development piece, to provide an alternative. I was in those refugee camps when the population was much smaller, but they were there in northern Kenya. And I saw that the conditions that people were surviving under. And my concern now, as a human being and as a former naval officer, is that if we fail to deal with the root causes, that it will not be enough to deal with the symptoms. Again, this consequence management thing, I think the military is coming along, but I don't think we're entirely there. And with each new change in leadership, although I have great faith in the current leader of the Defense Department, with each new change in leadership, then the potential is that the policy will shift and shift in the wrong direction. I'm concerned that, at least I haven't seen any initiative on the part of the administration to try to deal with the root causes, and I'm concerned about that.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
I would just toss into this too that it's 25 years on, and really, I mean, how many different iterations of armed groups have we seen operating in Somalia? So maybe al-Shabaab might be defeated, but what iteration? I mean, al-Shabaab came from the Islamic Courts Union, and they provided this tiny semblance of security and stability for a couple of years. And in some of the readings I was doing, there was like a moment where people also felt really encouraged by the ICU because they were picking up they had started municipal garbage collection again, and they were like, literally cleaning up the city of Mogadishu. And so, that was a hearts and minds campaign that then, as soon as the Ethiopians and the Americans teamed up and said, okay, but they've got these extremist elements, we've got to move on them, and then we have al-Shabaab. So I just feel like, until these root causes are addressed, it's just, one name or another.
I started in Vietnam, and we made the same mistakes in Vietnam 50 years ago, 45 years ago.
And I think you did a very good job of telling the stories of people who don't want to do this. Right. But I think the one gentleman said, if you get to choose between starvation and security, you're going to choose. No one wants to starve. Exactly. And John, this is the sequencing thing we're talking about too. That people need to feel safe. They can't live if they don't feel safe. But the long-term safety, the long-term living has to be a bigger investment or a different investment.
I think so, and I guess some of this gets back to kind of human behavior as well. There's some interesting observations. Somalia is a bit, unique in that you've got an AU force that's comprised of Ethiopians largely, and there may be some backlash there. But as another dynamic that tends to go on in these situations of extreme drought where there are armed opposition groups where in times of plenty, people give to Shabaab as a way of buying security. When times are tight, like now, there tends to be a lot more conflict. In the short term, that's bad, but it could yield a result like it in northern Uganda, where the LRA were eventually pushed out because they were just, simply subsisting off, displaced people. So it may be one where I defer to the experts on this one, but where you let that run its course a bit during the drought rather than making a big push.
And questioner, you asked it, and you were living this. Yeah. Do you agree with those answers? So I realize it's not fair to turn it back on the audience, but you identified yourself as an expert on this.
We struggled. This is actually something that the Defense Department had been trying to push for quite a while, and there were all kinds of reasons why there was some significant pushback in the interagency. One of them was what Laura was alluding to, dealing some kind of a death blow to al-Shabaab. In some respects, given what we were seeing through intel channels, might have actually empowered ISIS in Somalia, and so we had concerns about that. But I think this issue of allowing that to play its course, I do see some inherent logic in that, because the minute a force like al-Shabaab becomes a much more predatory actor against the local population, that is obviously in the near term horrible for the local population, but it does create a long-term conflict resolution opportunity because it's going to disempower that group. You could say the same with Boko Haram right now. It's facing a similar situation. There's terrible food insecurity, and Boko's main main way of expressing itself these days seems to be blowing up 12-year-old girls in local markets. That's not something that's going to endear themselves to the local population. But back to the broader point, until Nigeria and Somalia get the governance right, there's only so much that can come of that opportunity, right? So until
it all weaves together, I think. But governance is a really important strand. Other questions or comments? The gentleman here in the front. Let's collect a couple.
Ken Meyergord, a retiree. Back in the 19th century, the high plains were known as the Great American Desert because it got so little rain, and it was felt that agriculture could not be conducted west of the 100th meridian, which more or less goes through the center of Kansas and Nebraska. Then they discovered the Oglala Aquifer, and through tapping that's become a very rich agricultural area. It's under 5 or 6 states out there. Has anybody looked for a similar aquifer under Somalia?
Okay, hold that. Let's collect another question because we're coming towards the end. So I want to make sure that we get, I think right here you had a question? Yeah.
So in the film, it seemed like there were sort of at least three groups of people that were sort of mentioned. There were like fishermen who were having certain problems, and then there were like cattlemen or like shepherds that are having certain problems, and there were farmers. And I was wondering if you could talk about how those types of problems are different, and if like one of those problems is like easier to crack, I guess.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll let our panel answer.
Just a few pages from your very fine article in this magazine. There's a 4-page paid advertisement from Madagascar bragging about oil exploration and making it more easy for outside governments to drill for oil in Madagascar. I happen to know it's a very fragile, sensitive island, and it just shows the kind of confused message, perhaps, in Africa, and I wondered if you could comment on that. It's right here.
And I will say that they don't control the advertising in the magazine, so but I get your point. No, but I get your point, and would say that I'll take the liberty of answering that a little bit, and then Sheikh, I think you could talk about the aquifer. But what I would say to that is that it's all a contradiction, that we live in a global economy that's powered by fossil fuels, that I like electricity a lot, and I drive a car. It happens to be a plug-in hybrid, but it still uses gasoline too. That we live in a time of transition where we have hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty all over the world that are wanting the standard of living that we enjoy here. And we need to be true to those aspirations and lift people out of poverty in places like Somalia, but also find a better way to do it. And we live in that time of contradiction. So I would say that, they're not responsible for advertising in the magazine, but I get your point. But I would say, I think the more realistic we are about the fact that we live in a time of contradiction and that we own it and deal with both things at the same time, the more realistic our solutions are going to be. All right, let's talk about water, aquifers. Where are Somalis getting their water?
Yeah, I just mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that most of the surface water comes from rain, but you're totally right. I was a co-author of the OECD Atlas on Water Resources in Africa. There are more than rainfall water available in Africa. We have near-surface aquifer. We have deep water in the soil. And believe me, those countries which are on the dry area, like the Sahel area, between the desert and the savanna, the reserve of water outgoes the needs of populations. But to get that water, you need energy. And energy is lacking, unfortunately. And that's why I was talking to Excellency, the Amiral, about the connection between the three security issues: energy security, food security, and water security, plus the overall security. It's the nexus approach. If you don't have energy, you can't access that water. If you don't have energy and water, you can't have food. So that's the connections between them. But definitely there is a lot of water, but it needs a lot of investment to be rich.
So energy is a euphemism for poverty.
Sorry, once again?
Energy is a euphemism for
yes,
poverty.
The energy consumption, if you overlay it on the poverty layer, which we did on Africa, poverty level and energy consumption, there's a
highly correlated.
Yep.
All right, fishermen, pastoralists, and farmers.
Yeah, so I think there are a few places where the majority of people living in that country are entirely dependent on the land and natural resources as Somalia. And part of that's because they've been in conflict for the last 25 years, and there hasn't been the same type of opportunity for other economies to develop. And people are tied to the land in different ways. So some of those people are nomads who travel with their animals to find pasture and water and survive that way. Some people are farmers who require land for their fields and their crops to support their families. And some people are fishermen. And they rely on the marine resources for their livelihoods. And so one thing we saw kind of across the board was that as these natural resources become threatened through environmental degradation and climate change, people are pushed into really desperate situations. That can be extremism, piracy, internal conflicts. It plays out in many different ways, but the general theme is that people are tied to the land, and as their ability to survive from it becomes threatened, they have to make some tough choices.
A lot of people moving into cities. Sheikh, did you have
Just a very quick one. I mean, the same thing is happening in Senegal, in other lakes, as you mentioned. But what we observe around Lac de Guiers, which is the only fresh water available, as the urbanization is growing and the demand for food in urban is growing, and as agribusiness comes into process, there's a kind of concentration of population around very small reservoir of water. And this creates land competition, which is beyond the local land grab, attract investors from outside. That's the same thing on the fishermen. He was frustrated that other company came to grab their resources, and the issues of resource grabbing or land grabbing goes beyond just the food thing. It's also water grabbing. Every time you export 1 ton of cereal, it's 1 ton of cereal plus the water which make that cereal to grow. So that's the kind of issue also we need to look in the connections in the market and the food commodity market.
Any last comments?
Just a short one on the livelihoods question. We've done a good bit of analysis on that, and a common response is livelihoods diversification. So, spreading your eggs out, more baskets. What we found, especially in the face of severe droughts and other shocks like conflict, is even that's not enough. So to have a bit of farming and a bit of livestock, I think that livelihood independence is an area where the policy is going to try to have off-farm livelihoods that are not at risk of sort of climate shock. So maybe that's a market-based job. A lot of it comes through remittances or sort of extended social networks in the Somali context. And then just to push back one more time on this sort of narrative around joblessness as a major driver of support for extremism. I mean, again, there are certainly links and cases of that, but for us and a lot of other researchers, we have seen that it's a lot more complicated than that. And I think it's important for policy prescriptions not to think that, again, that a livelihood-focused solution is really going to change dynamics around big political conflicts alone.
And that's the importance of analysis. If you don't know what problem you're solving for, you're going to put the wrong solutions on the table. Lee, you get the last word. Admiral Gunn.
One other thing that we hadn't talked about was expatriates. There are powerful expatriate communities in the United States from all of these African nations. The Somali one in particular, Macalester College, is a center for that. I've carried on a decade-long conversation with the Abdi brothers there, who are both professors. It's an extraordinarily rich source of information, influence that's transoceanic, and I think the views that community can provide of the conditions there and the conditions here and the political environment in which changes have to be made in the United States can be very important to this conversation.
Which is a great way to end, to say, again, it comes back to the individuals who are living this experience and who have ideas about what's best for them. So thank you very much, all of you. Let's give the panel a hand. Thank you for coming. And please help yourself to copies of Foreign Policy and to postcards of Nikki's excellent work.